They finally dispersed on Monday or Tuesday, only to come back again the next Wednesday, the next weekend. And the issue, of course, there were two demands that the KMT-PFP made. The first was for a recount. They changed the outcome. Shui-bian and the DPP did some calculations of their own and realized that those invalid ballots really were invalid, so yes, let's do a recount by all means. Putting the ball back in the KMT court, and the KMT then shifted their ground and said negotiating and bickering and debating went on for a week. Finally, both sides agreed on a recount rather than a new election, although the mechanics of that recount have been subject to enormous contention. At this point, the recount it has been officially decreed, and it's going to take some time, apparently. I understand, although I'm not too expert on this, that it won't be ready, that the results won't be officially ready until after the inauguration on May 20th. So there will already be, Shui-bian will already be inaugurated before the recount is announced. I think I've probably used up all my time, so we can go back to some of these questions in the question and answer period.
Thanks, Barry. Our second panelist is well known to the great majority of you, a prominent figure in the sociology department here, but very well known throughout the country and in Asia as a specialist on China and Taiwan. Much of his writing has been in that area. So Tom, carry on.
Thank you, Matt. So this is an example of being hoisted with their own petard. My understanding was they thought that DPP voters would be less educated and less sophisticated, and therefore more likely to put the stamp in the wrong place. That's why they pushed it, and of course it literally blew up in their faces. When we were setting up this panel, we were worried that it was already a month after the election and everybody would be burned out and there would be no interest. There would be no story left to tell, nothing fresh. Well, the size of this crowd is overwhelming, and also the story is still not finished. It's still going on. As Rick said, there's secures there will be an inauguration on May 20th, but that also that the recount will still be going on as well. So this story is still not. Li-Fa Yuan legislative yuan elections, as well as now 2 presidential elections. And I want to stress that I have been invited by different organizations, some governmental, some within Taiwan civil society, and that I have been invited, and my colleagues also have been invited, not as monitors, but as observers. They're not looking for foreigners to give a seal of approval to say, yes, this was a fair election. What they have been doing is inviting foreign experts on Taiwan or on China or on democratization, on civil society, on electoral processes and so on, to come and see how elections are carried out in a case that not many people know very well. So it's a wonderful source of data for social scientists, but it is not by any stretch of the imagination an opportunity for foreigners to give the seal of approval that this has been a fair election. Though certainly, and again I would agree with what Rick said, most people who have come away from the elections in Taiwan, in particular this one, have stressed that the procedure is quite fair and open and transparent. Watching the voting process, watching the counting process, it looks as if it is really very difficult to commit fraud. Certainly in the old days when I first started observing elections, when the DPP had just been established, there were a lot of opportunities for fraud to be committed, and most of that, of course, was done by the KMT. Various ways of tampering with the election procedure, the counting procedure, unexplained power failures, so vote buying, all kinds of gifts, and so on. So there were a lot of irregularities, but most of these irregularities had disappeared, and the general consensus was that this election, to the vote, counting on Saturday night, was a huge surprise to most observers, including the DPP. As I said, according to Shen Fusheng, a major activist in the DPP, on a panel that he and I participated on Sunday morning, that their internal polls showed them losing by 7 to 8%. So, and then the Soviet had already left. And we watched them on TV, and then and hurt and bitter, sour grapes. Their whole attitude was a lot of whining about the mainland. It's not really rooted in Taiwan. This is all untrue. This is unfair media representation. Of course, for those people who know the KMT, course, this indicates something else about the ETTV and which is coming from the society itself. So, going back to Saturday night was rally. After the end of Seoul had left, there were other people who took the podium. Pan-Blue equals mainlander, DPP equals Taiwanese. So the DPP is certainly the majority Taiwanese. The KMT also has a lot of Taiwanese support. On Thursday night, because the Friday night rallies were canceled, the rally that Lowell and I and others in our group went to and then ran for governor in the 90s, he can deliver a stump speech in Taiwanese, and he can do a lot of his campaigning in Taiwanese. So the rallies are just scripted, they're unenthusiastic, they're people shout on cue, but there's no real hearting. This time they really seem to be quite energized and actually realizing that they had to put out in order to get in. So from the stage, a lot of agitation. The speakers were screaming themselves hoarse. On the one hand, they kept saying we have to be shape, we have to be rational, and on the other hand, they were trying to mobilize the crowd, to rev up the crowd, to get out on the streets to do something. They didn't specify what, but they were trying to mobilize the crowd. The DPP rally was extremely calm, extremely quiet. People were sitting there, holding hands, shoulder to shoulder, rocking back and forth, singing songs. It was more like a love, sort of a kumbaya fest. If anything, their program for reform in Taiwan, their planned relations with the mainland, with the United States, and with the international community. So here you have the KMT, the former Force for Order. My own research interests, let me just, one final thing is on Sunday afternoon, I went over in front of the Zongtung, the presidential office building, in order to see what was going on. Consolidated. There's a lot of different ways of defining consolidation, but one big catchphrase is that democracy has become the only game in town. Well, up until this election, I would have been arguing that Taiwan's democratic consolidation had really proceeded very, very far. That the democracy was the only game in town and the people were following the rules. Now, this election has raised a lot of questions. In a panel I was at Stanford 2 weeks ago, one of my colleagues, Larry Diamond, who's one of the world's leading experts on democracy, he's one of the editors of Journal of Democracy. He had just come back a couple of days before from Iraq. And to call him agitated would be an understatement. He was really quite, he had not been to Taiwan this time, though. He and I observed 2 elections together in Taiwan. But he was quite agitated about what he saw in Iraq and was quite concerned that Chen was irresponsible and was leading Taiwan to draw America into a war in which Americans would die as they were dying in Iraq. That was a very frightening statement, as you can imagine. But getting back to this question of consolidation, Larry was quite concerned that Taiwan's democratic consolidation had not proceeded as far or as smoothly as many people thought. And certainly from this, as I said, the election process, the campaigning and the voting and the vote counting all proceeded in a very regulated, a very predictable manner. The unpredictable part was the demonstrations afterwards. And the people who didn't seem to be accepting that democracy was the only game in town were the Pan-Blue people, the ones who had created the rules in the first place. The Lian-Song people, those are the ones who were out on the streets. They were the ones who were storming the barricades. They were the ones who were urging street demonstrations and continued unrest. Whereas the DPP people, the ones who had benefited over the years from democratic transition and consolidation, were the ones who were saying, we have to play by the rules.
And so one would have expected it not to have had a major role in the elections. However, I want to argue that the China factor was brought in by the raising of the issue of the referendum last summer. I think before this issue was raised, the issue of the referendums, the KMT had a comfortable majority. I think most polls showed them ahead by about 10%. But I think the referendums turned the election around, and why they did this is that they changed the whole central thrust of the election away from economics, which was the strong suit of the KMT, because the DPP had not had a very successful economic performance in the last 4 years, changed it from the question of economics to the question of national identity. How did they do this? Well, the referendums were first conceived to focus on the question of having a new constitution. After they went through the KMT legislative yuan, the legislative yuan very carefully limited the use of a referendum to questions of national emergency. And Shui-bian, with extreme quickness and quite vigorously. So it brought the confrontation between China and Taiwan back into the election and made the question of national identity a central focus of the election. This is the third time this has happened in the history of Taiwan's presidential election. In '96 with his visit to Cornell, bringing the China factor in, because China, at that time, not only objected, but of course launched missiles in the vicinity of Taiwan's ports and launched war games, very intimidating to Taiwan. The second time was, of course, in 2000, as he mentioned, the Taiwan White Paper, which was seen as threatening to Taiwan, and also Jerome Ji's statements right on the eve of the election, warning the Taiwan people, did exactly the opposite from what they were going to do. They voted their democratic preferences against the Chinese wishes. So it's been a very frustrating thing, a very frustrating sort of experience for China, even though China attempted this time not to get into the election. They were tricked into it by this referendum issue, which brought them in. They appealed to the Europeans. The French objected to the referendum. The Germans objected to the referendum. So he still continued to have his referendum on the same day as the election. Now the referendum didn't succeed, paradoxically, because apparently people were afraid to vote for what the Chinese warned them against. Let me just ask a few questions about this whole China factor. Of course, the history of it has been covered to some extent, but let me just review this. In the Maoist period, of course, the China factor was they negotiated the Sino-Soviet reconciliation, which seemed to be stuck in acrimony for several decades. But in Taiwan, they seem to sort of they seem to be completely unable to negotiate successfully. Part of the reason is because they refuse to negotiate, of course. They don't find the terms of negotiation successful. So they have to get by that and start negotiating. Once the negotiations start, I think that progress can be made across the street. So I've gotten sort of off the topic of the elections, but I think just to bring it back to the elections, I think that the elections were derailed, I think, fundamentally by the China factor. And I could be wrong about that, and we'll wait to electoral data to find out.
Thank you very much. I was part of the Party of Six, sponsored by the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, that went and looked at the cross-strait relationship. We entered Taiwan approximately 5 days after the election, 5 or 6 days, and were there 3 days. Then went on to Beijing, and were in Beijing for 3 days, and then had some discussions in Tokyo. In Taiwan, we also met with the leaders of the opposition, Vincent and James Song, and with a number of others, Vincent and James Song, and with a number of others in the political and academic spectrum. I would just make 3 points quickly. Chen displayed relative moderation. It was clear that he wanted to impress Americans with the fact that he was prepared to show flexibility. We incidentally urged that he put this kind of moderation into the May 20th. What on itself might be done in the coming weeks and months. It seems likely that at some point Lian Chen will step down. Will his successor be Mayor Ma, Taipei, or Wang of the legislative yuan? There could be a protracted period here of uncertainty and instability in the opposition. Now, in Beijing, we talked again with some of the very high figures, including the foreign minister, those in charge of Taiwan affairs, and some academics. The general line was hard. There was no show of flexibility on such issues as one country, two systems, or one China and Taiwan a part of China. At the same time, I think some of us noticed a possibility of some discussion or debate over strategy. And when we put forward the idea of negotiating without conditions on the three links where there were mutual interests, some elements nodded, others nodded the other way. But I think this is going to be a period of private thinking and consultation as to how best to deal with the Taiwan situation. Clearly, the current leadership, fourth generation, pragmatic more than ideological, intensely involved in domestic issues, does not want a major confrontation. The risk would be minor incidents, not, I think, a massive war. And that would create complications for us as well as for Taiwan. I would also make the point, and with this I'll close, that the general feeling about the United States, of course, varies. Chen Shui-bian, I think, realizes the importance of trying not to antagonize Washington. He needs the U.S., and he understands that he crosses certain lines, he gets into trouble, even with the Bush administration, as has been pointed out. On the other hand, he has a feeling, I think, that his legacy is to nudge Taiwan down the road to independence. Not to do this in a dramatic or flamboyant fashion, but to continue. If they see a mutual or self-interest. And I think there are those who are prepared to do this. At the same time, as ideology in China has gone down as an instrument of mobilization, nationalism has come up. And the present leadership has got always to keep that in mind. And that makes the complications when it comes to changing policies on the Taiwan issue. Well, let me close there and open it up. We'll start here. Yes, sir.
I'm saying the
A little louder so people can hear you.
my name is Kim Singh. I'm with Stanford University of the Asian American Public.
Leaning heavily on one side despite President Bush's early inclinations to defend Taiwan at all costs. He's backed off of that, and it's been a much more balanced in the American presidential.
The American presidential election, but whether that spills off into some of these other political issues, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think we'll have to wait and see.